Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. Many of us don't like being put into boxes or watching that happen to other people. My guest today has created a well-known radio program in which she allows her guests to reveal the complexities of their beliefs and their values. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Krista Tippett, host of the nationally syndicated public radio show On Being, which was formerly called Speaking of Faith, for reasons we'll be exploring shortly. Every week, the show and its blog offer deep and insightful conversations about religion, meaning, ethics, and ideas. Welcome, Krista.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's been a recurring theme of yours that you don't want religious people to be known by their debates and their points of conflict. When and how did you take on that burden?
Oh, well, I had been a journalist myself, so I was in print media, and then I went to seminary from 1991 to 1994. Came out, and as both a journalist and now a person who had a theological education, I felt like there was a black hole in media where this part of life that we call religious and spiritual could be discussed and revealed and explored in all its complexity. There was a lot of religion in media back then, as there has been for several decades in our public life, but it was mostly very simple, short answers. It was a few strident voices who worked well and made for good sound bites. And what gets lost precisely when religion is in the news a lot is what I call the spiritual and intellectual content of religion. And so that's what I wanted to explore. I felt like public radio was a place where that should be able to happen. So that was this kind of my mission that I got on in the late 90s. And it was something that took several years. It felt like some big rock I had to roll up a hill.
To build up.
You know, we got it up the hill, at least part of the way. So.
It does seem like, particularly in the media, the coverage is all about fitting people and their beliefs into boxes. And some of us who espouse religious faith spend a lot of time trying to climb out of those boxes. Are you trying to make the boxes bigger so more people can fit into them? Are you trying to tear up the boxes?
I would say I'm trying to shine a light on this part of life, how it really works, and not as a compartment in our society. You're right. When religion makes the news, or especially when it's made the news the last decade, it's because someone throws a bomb in the name of religion, or someone says something really inflammatory and provocative, and it becomes a soundbite. It becomes this center of debate. There's an irony, there's kind of a public relations problem that religious people have in that, and I say this a lot when I'm out speaking about this also to media types, that in my experience when devout Christians, Muslims, Jews, devout people in these great traditions are really living deeply, really rooted in these traditions, there are qualities like humility that makes them the last people who are going to throw themselves in front of microphones or television cameras. So what I say is that as a journalist, and I think you're doing this too, we have to go out and look for these voices, and we have to invite them to speak, and we have to create what Parker Palmer has been a great kind of mentor to me, a Quaker writer and thinker. He says that to invite the insights of the soul to speak, which is different from our emotions, and it's different from our intellect, it's different from our opinions. He said that needs quiet, inviting, and trustworthy spaces. And that's been a really formative idea for me in creating the show, is that, and not just in creating the show as it is broadcast out, but when I sit down to have an interview with someone, that I'm creating an intellectually hospitable space, a quiet, inviting, and trustworthy space. And then I think something different can happen than happens on a Sunday morning talk show on cable networks, right?
Yeah. You've written a piece on, I think you called it Rules for Discussing the Meaning of It All. And your two rules are you're not to talk in abstractions about God, and I want to come back to that in a second. And you ask the guest to speak in the first person, to speak about his or her own experience, but not to speak on behalf of the denomination or the faith as a whole.
Right.
Has that been hard to follow?
It's not. It's not hard to follow, but you do have to kind of lay that as a ground rule, as an expectation, because what we tend to do in our political and media culture is to ask people to pronounce, right? And we ask religious people to pronounce too, in the same way that political people pronounce. So one thing I think is that when you take a religious idea, a religious insight, a piece of religious wisdom, it's more easily distorted and damaged and skewed when it's put into that kind of form.
Because it's been oversimplified, is that?
It's turned into a blunt weapon, right? I mean, people say, why is religion so dangerous? Well, it's dangerous because it's powerful. And when these kinds of powerful impulses and questions and certainties are channeled towards destructive purposes, they're more destructive. But I think that what happens when you ask someone to speak for themselves is they get out of that pronouncing mode. They connect the ideas. You know, maybe I'm doing real theology with people sometimes, but I say, let's connect the theology with human experience. And what is so powerful about that, not only is it asks someone to speak from a different place in themselves, but it's listenable. It's listenable. And what it actually does, one thing it does is it humanizes doctrine, right?
Yes.
You attach, for the listener, you've attached a face and a voice and a story to an idea that might have seemed strange or frightening before. And suddenly, they can be curious about it in a way. They don't have to feel threatened by it. It's humanized.
To get back to the metaphor of boxes and putting people in boxes, we also put atheists and agnostics in certain kinds of boxes, and you've challenged that quite a lot. And I wonder, you have found lots of spirituality in the writings and the thoughts of some atheist thinkers.
I feel like one thing we can name in the 21st century is that, and we're learning this in every sphere of our lives, definitions and boxes and categories that worked even 20 years ago don't work anymore. And I feel like religious labels and labels of atheism and agnostic don't fit. And we are at one of these really remarkable moments in history. Joan Chittister is a Benedictine nun. I'm sure you know her, and many people have read her. She says that we haven't been in a time like this in history since the 14th century.
Why is that? What's different?
Well, basic definitions are up for grabs, including when does life begin and when does death begin, and what is a marriage, and what does a family look like, and our political structures are changing, our media structures are changing. The nature of information is changing, along with that, the nature of authority. This is huge. I mean, this is going to reform all of our sectors. I like to say it feels like we're in the middle of a reformation, but this time it's a reformation of culture. Religion, of course, will be part of that too. So we're at this remarkable moment in history where even the very fundamental question, what does it mean to be human? We are filling that with all kinds of new insights and understandings and tools and structures. Now, our traditions, Christianity certainly, Judaism, Islam, these great traditions, Buddhism, they have carried questions and discussions and, I like to say, spiritual technologies aimed at that question across time and across generations. So they are repositories of wisdom. But that question, what does it mean to be human, is not limited to religious people.
So do you think that the traditional religions are becoming inadequate for explaining our condition?
No,
or?
I think they're more necessary.
Okay.
I think they're more necessary. And I think part of the challenge for religious people in this age is to really mine those repositories, and mine that wisdom, and mine those modes of reflection, those modes of inquiry as much as the answers, and offer those up as a resource to our common life. But what I know also, and what I've experienced in my interviews, what I experienced in the culture, is I think that, again, as you said, these words, atheist and agnostic, are really, it kind of gets at the science-religion discussions I have too. That scientists, sometimes atheist scientists, are some of the people who are most passionate about mystery, more passionate and engaged with the idea of mystery than most of the religious people I know. So, I want to honor that. I think that in itself is mysterious.
So, and it seems to me that faith requires wonder and mystery, and so that's part of the reason that you needed to change the name of the show, that its own container needed to be broader.
I felt like Speaking of Faith wasn't a spacious enough container in many ways. And in a more fundamental way, where we've gone with this program, where my conversations have led me, how this radio conversation has unfolded, has been very much about not talking about faith as something over here, something that people do on Sundays or something that happens in religious institutions. But what I've tried to shine a light on and draw out is how is faith, how are lives of faith, how are theological ideas and questions manifest in every sphere of our common life. We've kind of narrowed the idea of public life to political life. I mean, I really want to break that open because public life is a lot bigger than politics. Sure. It's what's happening in medicine, it's what's happening in education, and I don't just mean in educational policy, in our schools, in the minds and hearts of our teachers and our students, right? It's how we are parents. It's what's happening in quantum physics. So to say that the show is about speaking of faith doesn't quite get it. I think the show, Speaking of Faith, is part of it.
Right.
But I would say this, I mean, I'm still trying to formulate this in my head, how I can explain this in a soundbite. I think that what I've explored, what I'm most captivated by, is how faith and mystery are internalized and show up in lives. And in this pursuit that, again, religion is an incredibly necessary and vibrant repository for, but it's not limited to this pursuit of the question, what does it mean to be human? And also, how do we want to live? I mean, that's the follow-up question that this century is requiring of us. We are going to have to reconstruct our institutions and our relationships, right? The nature of human relationship is changing. And again, there is no greater wisdom on that than faith traditions.
Than these long-held
right?
faith traditions.
Right?
You say that love should enlarge our conversations and not narrow them. You often ask a guest to illuminate or to speak further, but you rarely challenge them. Do you ever find yourself having to suppress the urge to disagree?
Well, I think I have a different idea. I have a different definition of what it is to be challenging in a question. And we have this idea in the culture about what a challenging journalistic question sounds like. And for the most part, it's a question that makes the journalist sound tough. It's more about how the journalist is posturing. My definition of a challenging question is a question that elicits a revealing answer. Sometimes I think some of the most challenging questions I ask people are when I have read deeply in their work. I've kind of tried to immerse myself to have a sense when I go into the conversation, not just what they know, but who they are and how they think. And if you sit down with someone and you have a sense that they understand you can relax. So even in that, you can go deeper. But sometimes when I read people their own words back to them, right? And
it has to surprise them sometimes, right?
Yeah, and maybe it's something they wrote 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Then the nature of writing is mysterious, just like the nature of a conversation is mysterious. So sometimes we put things in writing we didn't know we thought. And I think that sometimes I find something like that. So sometimes I might read somebody back their own words, something that they wrote that is really profound and maybe in a moment of insight that they can't even recall. And just asking them to explain that, to go deeper into something they observed, I mean, that can be an incredibly rich, revealing answer. It can be provocative and uncomfortable, uncomfortably revealing. So yeah, I want to think that I model a different idea about what's challenging.
And I appreciate that. In Einstein's God, in your newer book, I notice in the different conversations you have, one of the things that pops up again and again as you explore the relationships and the intersections between faith and science is the analogy of poetry and math.
Yes.
And I thought that was really, really interesting. So for instance, there's a line in there about reading Genesis as science is the equivalent of reading poetry as prose.
Some truths can be put into a mathematical equation and can only be proven by a mathematical equation. And some truths it's not just that they can be better conveyed by poetry, they can only be conveyed by poetry.
Right.
And you know what? We used to know this. I mean, human beings have known this. The Bible knows this. You know, the book of Job, for example, is a poem, but we read it, but we don't even know that.
I feel like that's something that Western culture in particular has lost in the last maybe 150
it's
years.
Very short time.
The ability to
yes.
to find truth in metaphor.
Yeah.
And to recognize it as truth and not something inferior to
Although what's
truth.
interesting to me is we've actually put a lot of poetry on the air, more and more. And I would say it's happened organically. It's not like we've sat down and said, let's have poetry. But one reason it's happened is that when we put poetry on the air, it's magnetic. People go for it. They love it. It's another layer.
You're right. It's a different place to
different
dwell
place.
and experience.
And I've got Elizabeth Alexander. I interviewed her before I left, the poet who read at the Obama inauguration. I went into that interview with her. It was very much on my heart that right now there's so much there's a lot of despair right now, babe, and it's economic, okay? It's material. I went into it with this question that I know I'm not the first person in history to ask this, but can poetry be relevant in a moment where people don't know how they're going to pay the bills this month or whether they'll be able to stay in their house or buy clothes for the winter for their children, right? She came back, but even before I asked that question, she started reciting poetry for me from the Gwendolyn Brooks wrote in Chicago in dire economic circumstances. And you know, before I'd asked the question, she demonstrated how, in fact, at these edges of life, in the darkness as much as in the light,
that's when we need the poetry.
That's when we need the poetry, and the poetry nourishes us. It's mysterious again.
You've said that faith is as much about questions as about answers. I'm not sure that's a common perception. What have you learned about others resonating with that?
Culture doesn't tolerate ambiguity and nuance. A life of faith has all kinds of different understandings of what is real and true. Some of them contrast with what we're being told is real and true all the time, right? There's nuance, there's ambiguity to that. There are things you can't tie up. So that's one level of it. And another level is that and I think this is a realism about faith, that faith is there for us in moments in life where nothing makes sense, where we don't have the answers. It takes the parts of life that are difficult and confusing and unresolved, it takes them seriously. And it says you live there and you trust there, you keep breathing, you read, you pray, right? But so faith treats the questions and the questioning moments of life. It has a reverence for those things,
them.
and it says you have not just does it doesn't just take them seriously. It says find sense right there, make sense there.
So the fullness of a person's experience includes the questions as well as the answers. Maybe that's what softens it from being dogmatic.
It does. Now, a lot of the religious certainty that comes to us through media now is certainty that is born of fear. Right? All this change I talked about a minute ago that you can see as wondrous and beautiful and thrilling, very stressful for human beings. Like we know this science is telling us now about ourselves biologically. Yeah. It's stressful. More stressful for some people than others. You know, we're hardwired differently. That's actually something that I think needs compassion. I mean, this is kind of a big idea, but I feel like along with a greater recognition of the tumult, both the promise and the peril of the moment we're living in, somehow in our common life, and maybe this can only happen in religious institutions, maybe it can't happen in the news, but we need to develop compassion towards ourselves and towards others. And we need to start to hear the fear behind the anger. But what we hear, what gets drawn out in front of microphones and cameras, is the anger. And then it's dehumanizing, right? It's the opposite of this effect we talked about a minute ago. It does cause you to see this person as some completely other, unfathomable creature that you could never find any common ground with.
Have you ever had a guest who simply wouldn't open up to that vulnerability?
I'm careful not to invite people on the show unless I really feel like they're going to be able to talk. at that intersection of ideas and experience. And there are, I don't interview a lot of religious authorities or political authorities. And that's because people in those kinds of positions, whether they're religious or political, are actually bound to speak for a group. So they're just not going to be able to go there with me.
So the Pope maybe wouldn't have the luxury of revealing personal doubts because...
Right, and he wouldn't, even if he used the word I, I mean, I probably would interview
You're right, he would still be...
I probably would interview the Pope if
that's
he
a bad
called me.
example. Do you ever get accused of only interviewing guests who that you already resonate with or something? I mean, I guess you have the right to do that.
I have the right to do that. I do choose guests who fascinate me. That's true. But I also think that I have developed some instincts over the years to feel what is going to be fascinating for others, who are different from me. But we don't go for the obvious people. I mean, I would say we get criticized more for not interviewing the obvious people, not interviewing the religious authorities, or not interviewing Richard Dawkins when he was the best-selling author. But I feel good about the range of political, right, left. I mean, I don't even like those categories.
Yeah, categories bother me in general. I mean, we need them because we can't cope otherwise. But you're right. They limit how we understand one another.
Well, and we're not aware as we could be that they've been created and defined for us by media and political formats, and that those are not the only ways to talk about things, and that in fact they may not be the best ways to talk about important things.
What have you learned about your own listening skills?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. There's not much real listening in media or in politics. You give everybody their 5 minutes or their 2 minutes to say what they have to say. And a lot of journalism is about asking questions and then asking a follow-up question, but that's not necessarily the same thing as listening. And we don't even have the time and the space for real listening. I mean, I do 60 to 90-minute interviews, which are then crunched down. But somebody can pause, and they can say something, and then they can start over and say it differently, or we can come back to it 20 minutes later. When we turn that into a radio hour, and we make it more linear, and we make it more cogent. But in a lot of these live, because we're very hooked on that, the kind of live format, you can't do that. And they're doing the same kind of weeding out that I'm doing. I mean, they're getting people who are going to have crisp, sharp, short answers.
They need the kind of guests they need because they don't have that space. What evidence are you seeing in the response to the program or the people that you talk with that you're getting somewhere with this, that maybe you really are teaching us a way of thinking or a way of relating to one another that is missing from other media?
Well, I have to say that is the most nourishing thing about this, and that kind of response that we've always gotten to the show has been what's always fed me and kept it, and also kept it alive in a real way. I don't have Oprah numbers, Right. I don't have wait, don't tell me numbers. But these are weighty, that people are actually being revealing. They're important ideas. And so you'll hear a lot about how we live in this entertainment culture. People will tell you, and they told me when I started the program, even in public radio, that you really have to do something that's entertaining and short, and people won't listen for an hour, and you can't have one voice for an hour. Well, it's true that in many ways we and our children are being trained to consume information differently. But I believe that there is a parallel hunger. That's just not the whole story. And we, in some ways, because of all this short, sharp, entertaining stuff that comes at us, and because of the complexity, we are becoming more aware that we need to ask these questions of meaning. We need ways to sort and prioritize and make sense. And I think that's behind a lot of the spiritual hunger that's out there, that sometimes doesn't define itself as religious. But it is a sense that we still have to figure out what matters. I think when we then take the time and the care to create something that is nourishing and that has depth and that has some beauty to it. See, that's a production value of ours. People do find that, and they find it useful. And we've just done some research recently. We've had some research done on impact, and we heard all these interesting counterintuitive things, like most people listen to our show together with someone else. I mean, either they're in the room with someone else or they have somebody else. And we've heard this a lot. You know, my sister lives halfway across the country. We listen to this show, we talk afterwards, or they podcast it. Also, something really amazing that people say that they are more likely, because of the show, to have a conversation they might not have had before, to do some kind of service project in their community.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So that is thrilling. It's not, we can't turn it into quantifiable numbers or ratings, but it's real, right? Again, it's real. And so that's why I do what I do.
Thanks so much. My guest today has been Krista Tippett, host of the nationally syndicated public radio show On Being. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.